Elliot Parker sat at the dinner table, his fork poised halfway to his mouth, frozen by the words his wife, Marissa, had just spoken. The warmth from the freshly cooked meal between them did nothing to counter the sudden chill in the room. "I tried another man," she said, her tone calm but deliberate. "And he's better than you in every way. You have to accept it if you love me." The sentence hung in the air like smoke, suffocating and impossible to ignore. For a moment, Elliot wondered if he had misheard her, if perhaps his mind was playing tricks on him. He lowered his fork, placing it gently on the plate as his mind raced to catch up with what she had just said. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice quiet but trembling with disbelief. Marissa didn't flinch. If anything, she looked irritated, as if his reaction was somehow inconvenient to her. "You heard me, Elliot," she said, leaning back in her chair and crossing her arms. "I've spent years trying to get you to see me, to hear me, and you never did." Nolan did. There it was. A name. A sharp blade to the heart. Elliot's chest tightened as the realization began to sink in. Nolan. The smooth-talking coworker she had introduced him to at last year's holiday party. The man who had been charming to a fault, even when it felt unnecessary. His voice was low, almost too calm. "You're blaming me for this?" Marissa tilted her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I'm not blaming you," she replied. "But I need you to understand why this happened. I've spent years asking you to be present, Elliot. To prioritize us. And every time, it's the same excuses: work is too stressful, the house needs this, you'll do better next time. But next time never comes, does it?" Elliot stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He began pacing, trying to channel the fire building in his chest. "So your solution was to, what? Cheat? That's your answer to feeling ignored?" "I didn't plan this," she shot back, her voice rising. "I tried to make this work, Elliot. I asked for things, simple things. Fix the garage door. Plan a date night. Just show me that you cared, for God's sake." He turned to face her, his expression a mix of disbelief and anger. "Do you hear yourself, Marissa? You're standing here justifying an affair because I didn't fix a garage door. How about this: why didn't you say something when you felt things slipping? Why didn't you tell me it had gotten this bad?" "I did," she said, her voice dropping now, tinged with bitterness. "Over and over again. But you never listened. And Nolan, he did." Elliot stopped pacing. The mention of Nolan's name again felt like salt in the wound. "What did he say that was so magical, Marissa? What did he do that I didn't?" "He noticed me," she said simply. "He didn't make me feel like I was just another responsibility to check off a list. When I spoke, he actually listened. He cared." Elliot stared at her, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a boulder. For years, he had worked tirelessly to provide for her, to make sure their life was secure, to keep their home running smoothly. And now, it felt like all of that had been dismissed with a casual shrug. "And what about now?" he asked finally, his voice low and steady. "Where's this Nolan of yours? If he's so much better than me, why aren't you with him right now?" Marissa hesitated, a flicker of something, shame, perhaps, crossing her face. "Nolan isn't ready for that kind of commitment," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Elliot laughed bitterly, the sound cold and humorless. "Of course, he's not. Because that's what men like him do, Marissa. They sweep in when it's convenient, whisper the right words in your ear, and then vanish when it gets hard. But you know what? That's not my problem anymore." Marissa's eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Elliot said, stepping closer, "that you're going to pack your things tonight and leave." Her confidence faltered, replaced by uncertainty. "Leave? Elliot, you're overreacting." "No, I'm not," he interrupted, his tone sharp. "You made your choice when you decided I wasn't enough for you. And now I'm making mine." "Where am I supposed to go?" she asked, her voice rising in panic. "Nolan's not an option right now, and That's not my concern anymore," he said firmly. "Stay with your mother. Or a friend. Or book a hotel room. I don't care." But you're not staying here. Marissa stared at him, her defiance slipping away as the reality of his words sank in. You're really doing this? She asked, her voice trembling. Yes, Elliot replied, his tone resolute. Tonight. The silence that followed was thick and heavy, broken only by the sound of Marissa retreating to the bedroom to pack. Elliot stood alone in the kitchen, his chest heaving with the effort of holding himself together. An hour later, the slam of the front door signaled her departure. Elliot stood at the window, watching as her car disappeared down the street. The house felt emptier than it ever had, but for the first time in years, he felt a strange sense of clarity. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear, he wasn't going to let Marissa's betrayal define him. Elliot awoke to the faint light of dawn creeping through the curtains, but the house felt heavier in its silence than ever before. The events of the night played in his mind like a looping reel, the confrontation, Marissa's stony refusal to apologize, and the echo of the front door slamming shut. The emptiness was oppressive, but so was the sense of finality. His phone buzzed on the bedside table, startling him from his thoughts. A message from his sister, Leanne, lit up the screen. Let's meet for coffee today. You need to talk. Elliot sighed. Leanne had always been the voice of reason in his life, the one person who could cut through his stubbornness. He wasn't ready to rehash the details of Marissa's betrayal, but he knew isolating himself wasn't the answer. He typed back a quick reply, 10:30 at the usual spot. As he showered and dressed, his mind raced with questions he couldn't push aside. Marissa's parting words, about Nolan not being ready for commitment, gnawed at him. What had she expected? That he would quietly accept sharing his wife with a man who had no intention of staying in her life. The sheer audacity left a bitter taste in his mouth. By the time Elliot reached the coffee shop, Leanne was already waiting at their favorite corner booth, her coffee steaming in front of her. She looked up and gave him a sympathetic smile as he approached. Hey, she said, standing to hug him. Rough night? You could say that, Elliot replied, sinking into the seat across from her. Leanne waited until he ordered his coffee before diving in. Mom told me Marissa called her last night. Said she needed a place to stay. Elliot raised an eyebrow. Did she tell Mom why? Not the whole story, Leanne admitted. She just said you had a fight and she needed some space. Space? Elliot repeated, laughing bitterly. Is that what they're calling infidelity now? Leanne's expression darkened. So it's true. She cheated. Not just cheated, Elliot said, leaning forward. She admitted it. And then she had the gall to tell me I needed to accept it if I loved her. Leanne's mouth fell open. You're kidding. I wish I was, Elliot replied, running a hand through his hair. Apparently, Nolan listens better than I do and makes her feel appreciated. He practically spat the name, his anger bubbling to the surface. Leanne's jaw tightened. That smarmy coworker of hers. I knew there was something off about him. The way he looked at her during that Christmas party last year, it wasn't friendly. Elliot nodded grimly. She said he's not ready for anything serious, though. So now she's staying at Mom's, hoping I'll just take her back. Please tell me you're not considering it, Leanne said, her tone sharp. I told her to leave, didn't I? Elliot shot back. But even as he said it, a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. The weight of 10 years together, 10 years of shared memories, plans, and dreams, wasn't something he could brush aside easily. Leanne studied him closely, her expression softening. Listen, she said. I get it. It's hard to just throw it all away. But, Elliot, you deserve better than this. She made her choice, and now she's dealing with the consequences. Don't let her guilt trip you into taking responsibility for her mess. Elliot stared into his coffee, her words sinking in. I just can't stop wondering, he said quietly. Was it really all my fault? Was I that inattentive? Did I push her into this? No, Leanne said firmly. Don't you dare do that to yourself. You've always been the type to put your head down and work hard, for her, for the life you were building together. If she felt neglected, she should have had the decency to talk to you, not run off to someone else. Elliot nodded slowly, but the doubt lingered in the back of his mind. Before they could continue, his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen and froze. It was a message from an unknown number. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I think we need to talk. Nolan." Elliot's blood ran cold. He felt Leanne's eyes on him as he reread the message, his mind spinning. Why was Nolan reaching out? What could he possibly want to say? "What is it?" Leanne asked, leaning forward. "It's him," Elliot said through gritted teeth, showing her the screen. Leanne's eyes widened. "What the hell does he want? Does he think you're just going to sit down for coffee and chat about this?" "I don't know," Elliot admitted, his pulse quickening. "But now I kind of want to find out." "Elliot," Leanne said warningly. He held up a hand. "I'm not saying I'll respond. But if he's stupid enough to reach out to me after all this, maybe he knows something I don't. Or maybe he's just trying to save his own skin." Leanne frowned but didn't argue. "Just be careful. Guys like him don't play fair. He's already shown you what kind of man he is." Elliot nodded, tucking the phone back into his pocket. As he finished his coffee, his thoughts raced with possibilities. Was Nolan trying to manipulate him? Or was there more to Marissa's story than she had let on? One thing was certain, this wasn't over. Elliot paced the living room, his frustration mounting with every pass. The text from Nolan sat unread on the coffee table, glaring at him like an unwelcome guest. He hadn't replied, unsure whether to confront the man outright or ignore him completely. What kind of person breaks apart a marriage and then claims they need to talk? The knock at the door made him pause mid-stride. His heart jumped, thinking it might be Marissa. But when he peered through the peephole, his blood ran cold. Nolan. Elliot's hand hovered over the doorknob. What was this man doing here? He wanted nothing more than to send him away, but a part of him, a dangerous, simmering part, wanted answers. Slowly, he unlocked the door and opened it a crack. "You've got some nerve showing up here," Elliot said, his voice low and firm. "Please," Nolan said, his tone surprisingly hesitant. I need to talk to you. It's important." Elliot opened the door wider but blocked the entrance with his body. "Talk here. Whatever you've got to say, I don't want it stinking up my house." Nolan winced but nodded. His usually polished demeanor was cracked, his shirt rumpled and his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. "I didn't come here to make excuses," Nolan began. "What Marissa and I did, there's no defense for it. I screwed up. I know that." Elliot's arms crossed over his chest, his eyes narrowing. "So why are you here? To apologize? Or to rub it in my face?" Nolan shook his head quickly. "Neither. Look, I called things off with Marissa weeks ago. But she didn't take it well." Elliot raised an eyebrow, skepticism washing over him. "You expect me to believe you're the victim now?" "I'm not saying that," Nolan said, his voice growing firmer. "I'm just saying she's been lying to both of us." "Lying?" Elliot's voice sharpened. "About what, exactly?" Nolan hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "I didn't know whether to show you this, but you should see it for yourself." Elliot snatched the phone without a word, scrolling through the texts Nolan had pulled up. The first few messages were flirty, reminiscent of the charm Marissa once reserved for him. But as he read further, the tone changed. Marissa had asked Nolan for money. "I just need enough to cover legal fees. I can't leave Elliot without a safety net. It's hard to stay here and pretend like I care, but I have to wait until I've secured everything I need." Elliot's fingers tightened around the phone as he scrolled further. There were messages about their house, their finances, plans Marissa had been making to protect herself while undermining him. "She told me she needed money to leave you," Nolan explained quietly. "At first, I believed her. I thought maybe she was trapped in a bad situation. But then I started to realize, she wasn't being honest. She wanted the cash, but she wasn't actually planning to leave." Elliot's stomach churned. "So you're saying she used you to bankroll her safety net while she stayed here with me?" Nolan nodded. "When I caught on, I ended things. She wasn't happy about that." Elliot handed the phone back, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. "Let me guess. She's trying to win you back now, isn't she?" Nolan hesitated but nodded. She's been texting me, trying to pick up where we left off. But I'm done, Elliot. I'm here because you deserve to know what's really going on. Elliot's laugh was cold and bitter. That's rich. You destroy my marriage, and now you want to play hero by exposing her lies. I'm not trying to be a hero, Nolan said quietly. I'm just trying to do the right thing, even if it's too late. Elliot stepped closer, his voice low and sharp. You think showing me a few texts changes what you did? You knew she was married, and you didn't care. So don't stand here pretending you're any better than she is. Nolan flinched but didn't argue. You're right, he said after a moment. I screwed up. I don't expect your forgiveness. I just thought you should know what she's been planning. Elliot stared at him, his anger swirling with something darker, a bitter satisfaction at seeing the man who had stolen his wife reduced to this. Finally, he stepped back and gestured toward the door. We're done here, Elliot said. Get out. Elliot. Out. Nolan hesitated but eventually turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped. Elliot slammed the door shut behind him and leaned against it, his chest heaving with frustration. As the silence returned, he looked down at his own phone, where Marissa's name sat at the top of a new message, "We need to talk." Elliot stared at the screen, his hands trembling. This wasn't just about infidelity anymore. This was a calculated betrayal, a scheme to dismantle his life piece by piece. His thumb hovered over the reply button, but instead of answering, he tossed the phone onto the table and grabbed his car keys. If Marissa wanted to talk, she could wait. He had his own plans to make now. Elliot drove aimlessly through the city, his thoughts racing. Nolan's revelations had added a new dimension to Marissa's betrayal, a betrayal that wasn't just about lust or neglect but control. She had calculated every step, manipulating not only Nolan but him as well. He clenched the steering wheel, his jaw tightening. For years, he'd worked to build a stable life, and now it felt as though Marissa had been chiseling away at it in secret. The question was no longer if he would confront her, but how. His car rolled to a stop in front of a park, its benches empty in the twilight. Elliot turned off the engine, needing the stillness to sort his next move. Pulling out his phone, he opened Marissa's last message, "We need to talk." He stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over the reply button. He could already picture her sitting in his mother-in-law's house, crafting her next story. She was likely preparing an argument to paint herself as the victim, twisting her actions into something noble. "Elliot, I had no choice. I only did it because you pushed me away." He shook his head. She'd been lying for so long that she probably believed her own excuses. But now he had the upper hand. He had proof, and he wasn't going to let her manipulate him anymore. With a deep breath, he typed a reply, "Tomorrow. Noon. My house. Be there." The message was curt, devoid of emotion, and sent before he could second-guess himself. Marissa would show up, he knew she couldn't resist the chance to try to regain control. The meeting. The next day, Elliot prepared with methodical precision. He wasn't just confronting Marissa, he was dismantling her web of lies. He printed the screenshots of her messages with Nolan, the evidence of her plans to siphon money, and the DNA test results for added weight. By the time the doorbell rang, he was ready. Marissa stood on the porch, her appearance carefully curated. Her makeup was subtle but flattering, her dress understated yet form-fitting. She had always been skilled at presenting herself in a way that disarmed others, but Elliot wasn't fooled. "Elliot," she said softly, stepping inside as he gestured for her to enter. "Thank you for agreeing to talk. I've been wanting to explain." "Sit," Elliot interrupted, his tone cold. Marissa blinked, caught off guard by his brusqueness, but obeyed. She sat on the couch, smoothing her dress as she watched him warily. "I'm going to save you the trouble of spinning your story," Elliot said, sitting across from her. He placed the folder of evidence on the coffee table between them and slid it toward her. "Go ahead. Open it." Marissa hesitated, her fingers trembling as she flipped through the pages. Her face paled as she scanned the messages she had sent to Nolan, her requests for money, her disparaging remarks about Elliot. When she reached the DNA test results, her lips parted in shock. "This is insane," she stammered. "Where did you even?" Where doesn't matter, Elliot cut in, his voice sharp. What matters is that you've been lying to me for years. Not just about the affair, but about everything. You've been scheming, manipulating, using me to bankroll your safety net while you played house with Nolan. That's not true, she said, her voice rising. Elliot leaned forward, his gaze steely. Don't insult me by lying again. You told Nolan you were waiting for a safety net. You told him you couldn't leave because you didn't have enough money. Meanwhile, you stayed here, pretending everything was fine. Did you think I wouldn't find out? Marissa's jaw tightened. It wasn't like that. Then what was it like? Elliot snapped, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. For the first time in their marriage, Marissa seemed genuinely at a loss. Elliot took the moment of silence to press on. You didn't just cheat, Marissa. You tore apart everything we built together. And now, because Nolan doesn't want you anymore, you think you can crawl back here and fix this? Her composure began to crack. Elliot, I made mistakes. Mistakes? Elliot said, standing. His voice was calm, but the anger beneath it was palpable. This wasn't a mistake, Marissa. It was a choice. 1,000 choices. You chose to lie. You chose to betray me. You chose to turn our marriage into a transaction. And now, you're out of options. Marissa stood too, her voice desperate. What do you want me to say? That I'm sorry. That I was wrong. Fine. I'm sorry, Elliot. I was wrong. Her outburst echoed in the quiet house, but Elliot's expression didn't waver. You're not sorry, he said coldly. You're sorry you got caught. You're sorry Nolan left you high and dry. You're not sorry for what you did, you're sorry it didn't work out the way you planned. Tears welled in her eyes, but Elliot wasn't moved. He had spent years ignoring the signs, forgiving her selfishness, and making excuses for her behavior. But this was the end. What happens now? Marissa asked, her voice trembling. Elliot met her gaze, his expression resolute. What happens now is that you leave. For good. I've spoken to a lawyer. The divorce papers will be filed next week. And don't bother trying to come back for the house or anything else, everything you've done is documented. You'll get nothing. Marissa's tears spilled over. Elliot, please. No, he said firmly. We're done. She stood there for a moment, staring at him as though she didn't recognize the man in front of her. But when it became clear that he wouldn't budge, she grabbed her bag and walked to the door. As the door clicked shut behind her, Elliot felt an unexpected wave of relief. The storm had passed, and though his life lay in pieces, he was finally free to rebuild it, on his terms. The house was still as Elliot sat at the kitchen table, staring at the divorce papers he'd signed earlier that morning. The weight of 10 years of marriage felt oddly light now, as though the act of putting pen to paper had lifted a burden he didn't fully realize he was carrying. Marissa was gone for good, her presence erased from the house and, soon, his life. Yet, the silence didn't feel empty anymore, it felt like peace. The sound of a car outside drew his attention. Rising, he peered through the window. It wasn't a car he recognized, but when the door opened, and Marissa stepped out, his stomach tightened. What is she doing here? He muttered. She stood at the edge of the driveway, hesitant, before walking to the door and knocking softly. Elliot opened it, his expression cold but composed. You shouldn't be here, he said. I needed to talk to you, she replied, her voice trembling. We already talked, Elliot said, crossing his arms. You had your chance to explain, to apologize. And I told you it's over. What more is there to say? Marissa looked down, clutching her purse like a lifeline. I know you hate me, and I know I deserve it. But I wanted to try to fix this. Elliot's laughter was sharp and bitter. Fix it? Marissa, you didn't just break this marriage, you set it on fire and danced in the ashes. What exactly do you think you can fix? I'm not proud of what I did, she said, her voice rising in desperation. But I was scared. I didn't know how to handle the distance between us, the way we were falling apart. Elliot's eyes hardened. So instead of talking to me, you ran to Nolan. And when that wasn't enough, you schemed to get money from both of us. That's not fear, Marissa. That's cruelty. Her face crumpled, and she took a step closer. Please, Elliot. I made mistakes, but I still love you. I want to make this right. He stared at her, a flicker of his old feelings trying to surface. But then he remembered Nolan's texts, the DNA test, the lies upon lies. You don't love me, he said quietly. You love control. You love getting what you want, no matter who it hurts. I won't be your backup plan. Marissa reached for his hand, but he pulled away. Her voice cracked as she pleaded, Elliot, please. Don't do this. It's already done, he said, stepping back and opening the door wider. Leave. And don't come back. Her eyes widened in disbelief, but when he didn't move, she nodded shakily and turned away. Elliot closed the door behind her, locking it with finality. For a moment, he leaned against the wood, exhaling deeply. It was over. Or so he thought. 3 weeks later. Elliot's life had begun to rebuild itself. His lawyer assured him that the divorce was progressing smoothly, Marissa's manipulations failing under the weight of the evidence he'd provided. Work kept him busy, and he had started seeing Leanne more often, reconnecting with the parts of his life he'd neglected during his marriage. One evening, he sat on the couch, watching the flickering flames in the fireplace. The tranquility was welcome, even comforting. But when his phone buzzed, the calm cracked. It was a text from an unknown number, you need to check on Marissa. She's not doing well. Nolan. Elliot stared at the message, his chest tightening. A war waged inside him, anger and self-preservation against the lingering thread of responsibility he felt for the woman he had once loved. He debated for what felt like an eternity before replying, not my problem. Nolan responded almost immediately, she told me what she's planning. If you don't care, fine. But I thought you should know. Elliot's heart raced. He cursed under his breath before typing, what is she planning? There was no response. The silence stretched into minutes that felt like hours. Elliot's mind spun with possibilities, manipulation, a ploy, or something worse. Finally, unable to sit idle, he grabbed his keys and left the house. Marissa's mother's house. The street was dark when Elliot pulled up to the house, his stomach knotted with tension. The curtains were drawn, and the driveway was empty. He rang the doorbell, the sound sharp in the quiet night. After a moment, Marissa's mother, Cynthia, opened the door. Elliot, she said, surprised. What are you doing here? Where's Marissa? He asked, his voice urgent. Cynthia frowned. She's upstairs. Is something wrong? Without waiting for permission, Elliot pushed past her, taking the stairs 2 at a time. He reached the guest room and knocked sharply. Marissa. Open the door. There was no response. Panic surged as he turned the knob, it was locked. Marissa, he shouted, pounding on the wood. A muffled sound came from inside, weak and distant. Without hesitation, Elliot kicked the door open. Inside, Marissa sat slumped against the bed, an empty bottle of pills in her hand. Her tear-streaked face turned toward him, her eyes glassy. Elliot, she whispered. Rushing to her side, he grabbed the phone from his pocket and dialed 911. Stay with me, he said, shaking her gently. Help is on the way. The aftermath. Marissa survived. The hospital stay was brief, but the fallout was long-lasting. Elliot visited once, at Cynthia's insistence, but the woman in the hospital bed was a shadow of the one he had married. You didn't have to come, Marissa said quietly, avoiding his gaze. I didn't do it for you, Elliot replied. I did it for me. So I could walk away knowing I did the right thing, even after everything. She nodded, her lips trembling as tears fell silently. When he left the hospital that day, Elliot felt no desire to look back. The chapter with Marissa had closed, not with fire but with quiet resolve. His life was his own now, unburdened and full of possibility. And for the first time in years, Elliot felt free.